This is Mary Collardita, and today I'm going to be talking about a situation that happened in Persia with a queen called Esther. And Esther she was an orphan, and she was adopted by her uncle, at least that's what I understand. So I'm going to read my summary, and it is from the book of Esther, and it is starting in chapter 4 through chapter 7. This is a summary, actually a little bit of chapter 8 too. So in Persia, there was a noble who was like second in command to the king, and his name was Haman. Haman didn't like the Jews, and so Haman convinced the king of Persia to issue a decree to slaughter all the Jews as being treacherous to the government. Mordecai, and Mordecai is Esther's adopted father, her biological uncle. And the Jews mourned to God in sackcloth and ashes. Now, if you want me to go back just a little bit, the reason that Esther is queen in the kingdom of Persia instead of a Persian, or instead of, and she's a Jew. The reason she is because the queen before her, Vashti, was a little bit of she got a little bit full of herself. And the king had a banquet, and it lasted for quite a long time, I don't know, maybe a week. And on the last day of the banquet, he told his servants to go bring Queen Vashti, Vashti, to go get her so he could present her at the banquet, because she was just absolutely beautiful and he wanted to show her off. Well, she was having her own banquet at the time, and she said no. Like, you just said no to the king. So she was really quite full of herself. And anyways, all the guys, they were like, oh, if this happens and the queen herself, is disrespectful to her husband, then what's going to happen to us and our wives? And so they convinced him to make a decree that Vashti could no longer present her face to him as queen. She's no longer queen. And made a rule, like a law, that all the wives were to be subject to their husbands. So there that comes. So it's how it was, but now, as in any law, people disobey it, any unwritten law, so it has to be written down. It's kind of like, people driving their cars. If they drive reasonably, then we don't have to have a law that says you can't drive over, 70. But now we have to have a law. Okay, so anyways, the issue was sent out to find the most beautiful woman in the kingdom, and she would be queen. And that's how Esther became the queen of Persia. So anyways, going back to our story, Haman didn't like the Jews. I mean, he was an uppity kind of guy, and the Jews are probably not showing him the respect that he thought he deserved, especially this guy named Mordecai. He totally did not submit himself to Haman. So anyways, Haman got the king to issue this decree. They're going to slaughter the Jews. He had convinced them that they were treacherous and a liability, and that they would overthrow the government. So the only way to deal with that was to get rid of them. King said, okay. So now the Mordecai, all the Jews, mourned to God in sackcloth and ashes. Now Queen Esther heard that Mordecai was in mourning, so she sent her eunuch to find out why. And Mordecai sends the message back with the eunuch and asks the queen, his adopted daughter, to beseech the king on their behalf. So then Esther sends back a message to Mordecai and says, well, if I do that, if I go before the king and he has not summoned me, I will be killed. And then Mordecai responds back, well, don't think you're so safe. You're a Jew too, and says, well, she won't do it. God would provide another source. But maybe that is why God made her queen in the first place. So she listened to that, or listened to that message and said, well, she declared for her and Mordecai and the people, the Jews, they should fast from food and drink for 3 days. And so she did herself. She took off her royal garments and she put on sackcloth, and she undid her beautiful hair, and she tangled it up with dung and ashes. And she fasted for 3 days. And after that, she got herself all cleansed up and beautiful again, and headed to go see the king. And she had a maid in front of her and one behind her, holding the train of her robes. And she was leaning on the maid that was in front of her. And when she saw the king, she began to faint and fall upon the maid that was in front of her. And it says here that God changed the king's extreme anger, which she had seen, into gentleness, and he jumped up with great anxiety, and he held her in his arms until she began to recover. And he says to her, this edict only applied to the subjects. It didn't apply to you. And then he extended to her the gold scepter, which indicated that she was accepted and received before the king. And he told her, or asked her, to speak. And she said to him that she saw him as an angel of God, awesome, and yet his face was full of mercy. And then she fainted again, and the king was shaken. Now we're into Esther 5. But if we were to look at just Esther 4, the book of Esther, what would we think God's will is? Because that's the purpose of my little thoughts about Scripture, is how can we know God's will? Well, first off, let's look at Haman. It is certainly not God's will for the Jews to be destroyed. On the other hand, he's going to show himself powerful on behalf of the Jews. So as a consequence of life itself, those who follow God are sometimes really hated. Hated to the point where they are persecuted and slaughtered. And we know of modern day or contemporary examples of that. So, Mordecai and the Jews fasted because of their situation. So we can see, well, it's probably God's will. If it wasn't God's will, they wouldn't have done it. If they didn't think it would have worked, if they didn't think God would listen to them, they wouldn't have fasted. So somewhere in other scriptures in the past, in their Jewish history, the people were probably told to fast and pray. And so that's what they're doing. They're fasting and praying. So we know that can be God's will, to fast and pray. And the other thing is Queen Esther. She fasted and prayed too. And it is not our custom today to fast and pray and pour ashes over our head. But it's probably there someplace in the Old Testament where God must have said, if you're really sincere, do this. We could go outside and throw dirt on ourselves. It tells you the degree of how they're trying to humble themselves in the physical to show God that they were trying to humble themselves in the spiritual before Him. So we know that that can be God's will. So going on with our story, Esther was standing in the inner courtyard, and the king saw her. And he summoned her to come to him. And he summoned her by extending to her a gold scepter. So that's this way of you are clean and able to be presented before the royalty. And he says to her something pretty dramatic. He says, ask of me anything you want, even to half of my kingdom, and I will give it to you. Whoa. That's a lot. You have to think about, why would the king be so willing to give half his kingdom to his queen? Do you think he would have given it to Haman? He saw something in Esther that probably made him think, if I give her half the kingdom, it's not really going to make a difference in my kingdom, and it's not going to make a difference in who she is or in my power and authority. Because you don't just do that willy-nilly. I think there's other, there's probably other examples in Scripture, but I just can't think of them now. But anyways, so she asked him to come to a banquet that she had prepared that day. So she wanted him and Haman to come to this banquet. And so the king agreed. And then at the, let me see here. And then at the banquet, you know, the dinner that they're having, the king says to her again, ask of me anything you want, to half of my kingdom, and I'll give it to you. So right away, that tells us that her asking them, you know, asking them to come to a banquet was not, that wasn't her one wish that she got answered by them coming to the banquet. But he asked it again. And so she says again that she would like the king and Haman to come tomorrow to a banquet. So they agreed. Now, Haman leaves, and he is just really full of himself. He is so elated that he was honored to be the only guest of the king, well, actually of the queen, at a banquet with the king. But as he's going home, so just elated with himself, he passes Mordecai, you know, and Mordecai refuses to rise or acknowledge him. He doesn't fear Haman at all. I mean, Haman's walking down the street and must be everybody's bowing or they're doing something to show honor to Haman, and Mordecai does not. And you think, well, what's the big deal, Mordecai? I'm not exactly sure why Mordecai is not doing this, but he doesn't. And it truly irritates Haman. Now, it could be because Haman made this edict to kill the Jews, and probably it was because of Mordecai doing the same kind of behaviors earlier. So let's just make that assumption because I didn't go back and check on it. Anyways, the Jews are not very happy with Haman, and Mordecai in particular doesn't fear him, even though he knows that this man ordered their slaughter. But he does think that God is going to save them, because remember earlier when he sends that message to Esther, he says, you know, maybe God put you there for this reason, but if not, God will provide another way. So Mordecai was convinced that God was on their side. And if God be with you, who can be against you? Well, Haman. But God is God. So, Haman says here, praised himself to his family and friends and told them all that had happened. But then he says, but this Mordecai guy, I mean, he has no respect for me. And yet the king and queen, you know, they desired me to be in their presence. And so they think, well, they tell Haman, well, make a steak and put it, put it out front and set it up and ask the king to kill Mordecai by impaling him on this stake. Because after all, you are the great Haman. So, just looking at this chapter 5, what is God's will here? Well, I'd say it's God's will in terms of Mordecai to not place anybody above your obedience and allegiance to God, because somehow this was beyond being respectful. So, to put God first and not worship any man, which I think is why they got in trouble in the first place, because I think they were supposed to worship the king and Mordecai didn't, and probably some of the other Jews. And so that's why they were considered enemies of the state. Not being obedient to the government's law that made an idol of a human and forced worship. Okay, so it is God's will not to do that. And everything else, having a banquet, all of that is just normal everyday living. So what goes on next? This is chapter 6. So that night the king couldn't sleep, tossing and turning. Says, well, I want to know what's been going on in my kingdom. And so he asked for the chronicle of notable events to be brought in and read. And so the servant did, and was reading about a man named Mordecai who had reported to eunuchs who were conspiring to have the king assassinated. So the king heard this with great intent, because he says, so what was done to this Mordecai to reward him? And the person says, well, nothing. So the next day, Haman's out there waiting to see the king to ask him to impale Mordecai on this stake that he had set up, and king asked him in and asked Haman right away, not why he was there, but he asked him a question and says, well, what do you think should be done? Let me see what it says here. It says, what do you think should be done for the man the king wishes to reward? Now Haman's really full of himself, and he's thinking it's him. And he says, well, you could put a royal robe on him and give him a royal crest and present him to the people, as being this person who of great honor. King says, well, that sounds like a good idea. And then he tells him, so this is before Haman can say anything about Mordecai, he says, Mordecai, he's the one. He tells him what happened. This man prevented me from being assassinated by exposing the conspirators. So you, Haman, second, the highest noble, because that's what Haman had said, have the highest noble put the robe on him, etc. So Haman goes out, highest noble, and is humiliated by. So we have to think, this is a process. This isn't just all happening like, look at these, like bing, 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 bing. So Mordecai then is presented to the people with great honor. Haman goes home. He knows he's in trouble. And his friends and his wife say to him, well, if Mordecai's a Jew, you're really in trouble. And then the eunuchs come to bring Haman to Esther's banquet. So this is the second day. Lots happened. So we've gone from Esther presenting and fainting before the king, And then the next day he's like, says, ask of me anything you want, up to half of my kingdom. Says that to her twice. And Haman is set up a stake to impale Mordecai. So what is the Lord our God's will in this? Well, you have to be interested in how God has been moving through the king. And it says, when Esther first came to the king without being asked, he was fiercely angry. How dare you? But it was God above, our Heavenly Father, who changed his heart. He softened his heart. Hey, I know of another king, a Pharaoh, by the way, whom instead of softening the Pharaoh's heart towards the people, he hardened his heart towards the people. So this tells us that it is God's will to use leaders. He hardens their heart or he softens their heart. And we need to pray that the Lord soften our leaders' hearts so that they act mercifully towards God's people. That is God's will. And so the other thing here, it is God's will to bring humility to those who are proud. So the one who exalts himself was now humbled. The one who wanted to impale Mordecai, he was already the highest noble in the land. It wasn't good enough for him. He wanted the people to be subject to him in all humility, and they weren't. So God humbled him, had him place the robe on Mordecai and present him to the people. So it is God's will that we be humble and not proud. Pride comes before a fall, and how great will Haman's fall be? Well, let's look at the last part. At the second banquet, the king again, this is the third time, asked Esther, what do you want? I will give you anything up to a third of my kingdom. So, does Esther ask for a third of her kingdom? She asked for the life of her people. She said, it says here, she asked the king to spare her life and the lives of her people as they were to be killed. But instead of having them killed, she asked that he would sell them into slavery, and then she would not bring it up to the king again. So that's pretty interesting. She knows that the king, I love this, really, because she knows that the king has to save face. He had made a declaration that the Jews were to be killed because they were considered treacherous to the government. So he made this declaration that allowed them to be slaughtered. I think if they didn't bow down to, I should have looked it up, but I didn't. Sorry. You can look it up. It's probably someplace in chapters 1 through 3. But she allows the king to save face and says, sell them into slavery, because then you would be still punishing them, but not killing them. And she wouldn't talk about it again. And the king sounds like he's surprised by all of this and says, well, who and where is the man that decreed this? And I suppose I need to go back and actually look at it. Esther said, the enemy oppressing us is wicked Haman. Okay, so I have to go back. Let me find Esther back here someplace. Where is Esther? You'll just have to bear with me for a minute, because I think I don't ever like to do anything. Okay, 747. Okay, a little bit of patience. You can look it up yourself, you know. I'm just going to read it. Mordecai refuses to honor Haman. After these events, King Ahasuerus raised Haman, son of an Agagite, to high rank, seating him above all his fellow officials. All the king's servants who were at the royal gate would kneel and bow to Haman, for that is what the king had ordered in his regard. So everybody was to bow down and kneel to Haman. Mordecai, however, would not kneel and bow down. The king's servants who were at the royal gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's order?" When they had reminded him day after day, and he would not listen to them, they told Haman to see whether Mordecai's explanation was acceptable, since he had told them he was a Jew. When Haman observed that Mordecai would not kneel and bow down to him, he was filled with anger. Moreover, he thought it was not enough to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Since they had told Haman of Mordecai's nationality, he sought to destroy all the Jews. Mordecai's people, who were throughout the realm of the king. So in the first month, Nisan, in the 12th year of the king Ahasuerus, a lot was cast in Haman's presence to determine the day and month for the destruction of Mordecai's people. So that's why this isn't going to work. And the lot fell on the 13th day of the 12th month of Adar. Then Haman said to the king, "Dispersed among the nations throughout the provinces of your kingdom, there's a certain people living apart, with laws differing from those of every other people. They do not obey the laws of the king, and so it is not proper for the king to tolerate them. If it please the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them. And I will deliver to the procurators 10,000 silver talents for a deposit in the royal treasury." The king took the signet ring from his hand, and gave it to Haman, the enemy of the Jews. "The silver you may keep," the king said to Haman, "but as for the people, do with them whatever you please." So the king did say it was okay for Haman to do whatever he pleased. And he had told the king that, let's read it again, if it please the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them. So going back now, so Esther was asked again, this is chapter 7, what Esther wanted to have of his kingdom. And Esther said the life of her people, even if it is to sell into slavery. Then the king asked, who and where is the wicked man who decreed to do this? Seems like the king would have known, but maybe he forgot. And Esther said, the enemy oppressing us is wicked Haman. This guy. Haman was seized with fear of the king and the queen. And the king left. And the queen was residing on her couch because they didn't sit in chairs, they laid in couches while they ate and stuff. And Haman falls upon her, pleading with her to have mercy upon him. The king comes in, sees Haman there, lying on top of his wife, the queen, and his anger boils up, and he says, will you also violate the queen in my own house? And at that point, the servants come and they cover Haman's head. That's not a good sign. And a eunuch tells the king, which is kind of, by the way, Haman had put up a stake to impale Mordecai on. Now, the king already knows that Mordecai is the guy who was honored for saving his life from these assassins. And it's like, how treacherous is this Haman? And he ordered that Haman be impaled on that very same stake. Then, in the beginning of chapter 8, the king grants to Queen Esther and to Mordecai Haman's house. And Mordecai is admitted to the king, as the queen told King Mordecai that she was his adopted daughter. And the king gives to Mordecai the signet ring. God's will. What is God's will? For one thing, it is God's will to use rulers, kings, and authorities to bless his people or persecute them. And they were going to be persecuted, but through the persecution, God's going to bring a deliverance, because the Lord softened this king's heart towards Esther and then towards her people. And it was the Lord's will to those who exalt themselves in pride to humble them. And it even says, you will reap what you sow. What you get will be given back to you. So Haman was going to impale his enemy, and he received that same impalement. So how we treat others is very important. We are not to be proud. We are not to exalt ourselves, but rather we should humble ourselves. Like Mordecai and the Jews and Esther, they humbled themselves with fasting and prayer. And they humbled themselves by believing that God would take care of them, would provide for them. And they were obedient to God by not bowing to Haman. That's God's will. It's God's will that we put him first and that we be humble and we not be full of pride. And God uses circumstances. It wasn't by accident that the king didn't sleep that night and heard about Mordecai. It wasn't by accident that Haman was in the court to ask the king for the head, or to be able to impale Mordecai. It wasn't by accident that Haman was told to put the royal robe and exalt Mordecai before the people. All of those things were God's will. And it all boils down to loving God and being obedient to him, to worshiping him, to trusting him, to seeking him, to being humble before him, to cast aside and count as dung our pride and our self-centeredness. That's God's will. Thank you for listening. And pray about it.